Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game, and often role-playing is lost the second the dice hit the table for initiative. Yes, role-playing during combat, integrating combat into roleplay. It's definitely something that is difficult, and something that a lot of people don't think about immediately, because, quite frankly, when you're running combat in D&D, or even just playing combat in D&D, there's quite a bit to think about, so role-playing during that combat can be really hard. However, combat is a massive part of the game, and including roleplay during a combat encounter can elevate the story of your campaign and allow the players to engage with the antagonists of your campaign in a much more interesting way than if they were just talking during specific roleplay encounters. It is a tabletop role-playing game after all, and if you don't roleplay during combat, I think you're really missing a trick. Obviously, if you're not interested in roleplaying, this is kind of not the video for you, but if you are, venture forth, for I am going to give you a couple tips on how to integrate story and role-playing into your combat encounters, both as a DM and as a player. Without further ado, let's get started. Alright, for starters, and this one might seem very obvious to some people, but it is something you need to keep in your head. Try to talk in character during combat. Now, it is really important not to get carried away. Combat already takes a long time, and if you add dialogue into it, then it can take a really long time. Make sure to temper what you say, and use video games as the example. The first example I can think of off the top of my head is God of War. In God of War, the characters share words, but they're not overly dramatic. They don't go through tons of monologues. It's just ambient dialogue that adds to the experience. It adds to the character of the people you're fighting and you're playing as. This is really important for, I think, the DM especially. When you add dialogue to your bosses during combat, it can give them a little bit more character. How a person reacts in a combat situation, a much more stressful situation, than how they react in a more calm roleplay situation, they're completely different. It would give them more depth, more dimension. And if your players don't have many opportunities to have a roleplay encounter with the boss, because sometimes that just happens, like for example, my players right now, they're fighting a really big dragon who doesn't exactly have time to sit down and have a conversation about his motivations, so I'm writing dialogue for him to play during a boss fight that hopefully will eventually happen. Oh, and also, I don't think writing dialogue for your bad guy in preparation is a bad thing at all. That's not railroading, and it's definitely not writing a script. Just writing a bunch of ambient lines that you can read off during combat, I think that's actually really helpful. Just a couple one-liners to give your boss a little bit more character. That's definitely not scripting, at least to me. Just picking a couple random lines as a react or a respond, it's perfect. It essentially allows you to quickly pull off a line and then get back to running combat. Because especially as a DM, you are running a lot of things during combat, and role-playing on top of all that would be really difficult. So just adding a couple lines in prep can add that much more to the fight. I don't recommend prepping lines as a player, but using the time in between turns to come up with something you want to say, that can be really helpful. And also communicating with the other party members in character, that can give a lot to your dynamic. Now, of course, remember, don't get carried away. Don't go on a whole monologue because, you know, we are trying to play a game here, but adding dialogue to your combat as a player, especially using those in-between turn times to come up with something witty or something planning related, can add that much more to the experience. Role-playing in character in combat is also very difficult for players, but unlike the DM, you do have that time to think about what you're going to do, especially in larger groups. So yeah, talking during combat might seem like just an easy solution, but it is really difficult. However, you don't get good at something by never trying it at all. So if you want to add a little bit of story to your combat experience, try talking in character, both as a DM and as a player. Tip number 2, describing your attacks. Now, of course, the whole don't get carried away thing still applies here, but this one is, in my opinion, just as important as talking during combat, and I think a lot easier to do. when you're doing a description of your attack, you don't need to talk in character or anything, so you don't need to think about doing a voice or what to say in character. You're just describing what your character is doing, and in my opinion and in my experience, that is way easier to do. This is both for DMs and for players. Now, again, in my experience as a DM, this is actually really hard to do. I often just say, the bad guy attacks you, take X amount of damage, moving on. Which, yeah, lame. And especially in a long combat, it can be really, really hard to come up with creative attack descriptions for the same monster over and over and over again for every round of combat. It's really hard. Now, there are some ways to circumvent this. Number one, if you're playing a bad guy with a variety of different attacks, varying up those attacks can both make describing them easier and also make the combat more engaging. I just recommend that for any situation. But another thing you can do is, again, write down a variety of attack descriptions, just like the ambient dialogue I recommended before. Make this part of your bad guy prep. Obviously, I don't think that this is a priority. Even the ambient dialogue I was talking about before, it's not a priority. Work out the game stuff first, because you can't improv that. But if you have the time, this is something that is both actionable and really, really useful to do. This isn't even something you need to do yourself. There are tons of websites out there that give attack descriptions like a generator, and taking some of those is perfectly fine. That also works for the ambient dialogue I was talking about in the previous point. Now, as a player, again, using that time in between turns to figure out your attack description is really important. For spellcasters, this is something that is really fun to do, I think. Adding flavor to your D&D spells is awesome. It gives your character a lot more, well, character. A bard that sings an excerpt of the sea shanty Moby Duck before casting Evard's Black Tentacles would be super, super fun and adds a lot of character to that spell. That's a pretty out there example, but it can be a lot more grounded. A wizard that lists off a small description of how they use their spell components to cast a spell, Caleb Littlegas from Critical Role, adds a lot to that character. A wizard is clearly a practiced individual. They are meticulous and detailed, and letting that shine through during combat can give a lot to the character. Spellcasters are the most fun, in my opinion, to do this, but martial fighters can do this too. A monk that describes how they twirl through the air and how they attack specific parts of an enemy's body, again, can add a lot to the combat experience. It gives the players an image in their mind as well. D&D is kind of a unique experience. It's a game played in your imagination. There's no visual medium for D&D, or at least not usually unless you count minis and tokens and such. But describing combat in a more visceral and visual way can give you that image in your mind and engage you much more in the world. Combat in D&D can often be described as a slog, and I think by doing this, it takes away that sluggish experience. It makes it more fun. Now, that is balanced by the fact that you can't get carried away. Don't take like 3 minutes to describe your attacks, or even 30 seconds to describe your attacks. Just keep it grounded, keep it down low so that people can get to their turns. We are still playing a game, but adding those descriptions can make the game all that more fun, in my opinion. Alright, that is it for today's video. It's a bit of a shorter Tabletop Tavern Tips episode, but I think that this one is really useful. So, if you guys enjoyed this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips and you want to let me know, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more videos by me, then please do hit subscribe. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I'm going to go rewatch Season 4 of Castlevania. I will see you all next time. Farewell.